C'est un problème quand je ferme le... Excellencies, ladies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you, those present here and those in front of their screens. I'm told there are several hundred behind their screens now, to this conference on the theme of diplomacy and power. When first discussing today's event, the organizers, the University of Oxford Alumni Network and the Bridge Forum Dialogue, couldn't anticipate that the Russian onslaught against Ukraine would raise so many questions about successes and failures of diplomacy versus power. What we did anticipate is that diplomacy could hardly be explained better than by a person who was ambassador on a number of very important assignments in Africa, Middle East, and beyond, and who was diplomatic and foreign policy advisor to 3 British prime ministers, who has written several books about diplomacy. He has them in front of himself. And finally, he strengthens diplomacy in academia as principal of Hertford College at Oxford University. And this is Tom Fletcher. On my side here, to fuel the debate as panelists, are Arlette Consemius, former Luxembourg ambassador, among others, to the Kingdom of Belgium and NATO. Urban Gilström, CEO of Greenwelder, a startup platform for enhanced and improved use of social media with the aim to enable co-creation and solution. I will not be longer. After these talks and the contributions you will hear, there will be ample time for questions and answers, followed by refreshments in front of the room and in presence of the speakers. So for those who want to rub shoulders, there will be opportunity for that. And I'm very glad to welcome you all here again. So leading into Tom's speech, I would be very curious to find out what exactly does diplomacy do? What are its means? What can it achieve? How does it relate to power, to political players, and to those of the economy? And at the end of this conference, I'm sure we'll know a lot more about this and many other questions that will be brought up here. Tom, please take us on a journey around today's subject. The floor is yours.
This one I think is working. Is this one working as well? Am I allowed to go? Will that work? Okay, thank you. I'll just come down for the start bit, just because having written a book called The Naked Diplomat, I just want to show you that I'm not actually naked behind here. And this is really just a chance to, I was ambassador in Lebanon. I want to just throw a few Lebanese dishes, like a meze, on the table. And then with our extraordinary panel, we can work out which ones to dip the bread into as part of the discussion. It's a great honor. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, David, for this chance to join you in this extraordinary city. It's my first time, incredibly, in Luxembourg, and it certainly won't be the last. So to take up your challenge, Hugo, where do we begin? As you said, I was the foreign policy advisor to 3 prime ministers: Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron. In actual fact, the job title was one of those very British job titles, the Private Secretary for Foreign Affairs to the Prime Minister. It's one of those titles that doesn't really mean much outside the UK. And I was on one trip to China, and I couldn't work out why our colleagues on the other side of the table were looking at my name badge suspiciously. And so I asked our ambassador, why are they nudging each other and laughing at the name badge? And he said, well, it's been mistranslated. And the Private Secretary for Foreign Affairs to the Prime Minister has become the intimate typist. But even worse, the intimate typist for the Prime Minister's affairs overseas, which, as you all know, means something very different in English. And I promise you that I did many things for the Prime Minister, write policy, speeches, give advice when I could, but I never did any intimate typing. I was a therapist and a bag carrier and sometimes a punch bag, but not an intimate typist. So just really to get the conversation going today, there's a challenge which I've been setting to diplomats since writing The Naked Diplomat, which is to go back and listen to the story of a Chinese diplomat called Shen, 5 millennia ago. And Shen is one of the first diplomats that we have any record of, because he was the first recorded human rights case. Now, how did he become this human rights case? Well, Shen was a Sherpa. Some of you may have been Sherpas to leaders. It's the key job where you advise the leader, you help the leader to the summit. In diplomacy, we call the Sherpa's assistant the yak, by the way. It's the person who helps carry the bags and the papers to the summit. So Shen had this great job as the Sherpa to the emperor. And he was coming back from one peace conference. The peace conferences for Shen were very straightforward because the emperor would bury half of the defeated army up to their necks in the ground. It's quite easy to negotiate with people buried up to their necks in the ground. And Shen learnt the hard way a lesson which many of us are learning now about the nature of diplomacy and the evolution of diplomacy around us. Shen hadn't realized that his opponents at court had mastered the new technology, which was to rest horses each day along the 5-day journey back to the capital. Shen had one horse, which got tired. His opponents had 5 rested horses. As a result, they got the communication back to the capital 2 days before Shen did. And we know this because his furious emperor had Shen slow sliced, death by 1,000 cuts. As I say, the first recorded human rights case that we know of a diplomat in history. And what do we learn from that? Of course, we learn that if we don't master these new technologies, which are transforming the world around us, then we too get slow sliced. And what we're seeing at the moment, and anyone working in diplomacy feels this all the time, is that as a profession, as a craft, we are being gradually slow sliced. We're facing competition from businesses that think they can do diplomacy more effectively, from big tech, which has its own diplomatic arm, from other government departments, and from a society at large that cares much less about a world of hierarchy, of institutions, of maps and chaps that diplomacy is often represented, flags. And so we have to find a way not to be slow sliced and to adapt. And I think, and I'm sure in the conversation, and I want to leave plenty of space for the questions in the conversation, so I'll stop in a moment. But I think behind Putin, Afghanistan, COVID, Trump, Brexit, and I'm heartbroken not to see our flag behind us today. Behind all of these moments that so consume our attention at the moment, actually we have to step back and recognize that while we've been building driverless cars, we've actually built a driverless world. And that this smartphone in people's pockets is giving them a sense of agency and influence about a world around them, which makes our role as diplomats and the role of anyone who cares about diplomacy much, much harder. I think in understanding that driverless world, we have to step back and really take account of 3 great trends which are reshaping society around us. And 2 of them are not about technology. The first one is the rise of distrust, a political trend. People have much, much less trust, as I say, for anything that looks like hierarchy and structure. And this is not just governments. We're not just losing trust in governments or the media or in business. We're losing trust in doctors. Who doesn't now consult Dr. Google on the way back from consulting a real doctor? We're even losing trust in teachers. I've just come from checking the WhatsApp group of my younger son's the parents in the class, as we all message around about what was being taught in school today. And that loss of trust in anything that looks like hierarchy, again, makes the job of governing much, much harder. And so question number one is, can we get ourselves back on the right side? Can we become a profession that is gaining trust and not losing trust? How do we communicate with people in a way that shows that what we do in diplomacy is relevant to their lives, to their homes, their security, their prosperity, their values? Second big trend that we have to get on the right side of, again, linked to tech, but not about tech, is the perception of inequality. I was there in the room 2009 with the leaders of the G20 after the last great financial crash. And at the end of the meeting, as we tried to put the global economy back together, Gordon Brown had chaired the process brilliantly at the high point of his time as Prime Minister. At the end of the meeting, Barack Obama, recently elected, tapped the microphone and just said, unless we fix the global system, the next crisis will be even worse. And all of us nodded along and said, yes, you're right, Mr. President. And of course, none of us fixed the system. And what we've seen since then is this perception of inequality getting stronger and stronger. And we've seen the impact that has on politics and society around us. There's an amazing experiment, you can find it on YouTube, where scientists are feeding 2 capuchin monkeys. And they give both a bit more food than they had before, but one a little bit more than the second one. And the second one, despite the fact that it has more food than before, is so jealous of the one that has even more that it rips the cage apart and attacks the scientists. It's a great metaphor for the rise of extremism, for Make America Great Again, for take back control, for this sense that life is somehow unfair. Anyone who's looked at Twitter today will have seen this barrage of insecurity, instability, a desire to take back control, this feeling that the world is somehow unfair. So what can we do as people who care about diplomacy and statecraft to get on the right side of that dividing line? To really show that we are about dealing with global inequality and aren't part of the problem. And then the third trend is about tech. And we assessed in the book that we will go through as much technological change in the next century as we did in the last 43 centuries. And just to put that into context, I mentioned driverless cars. That's like going from cave paintings to the driverless car in a couple of generations. And if you think what the internet did to politics and society in Europe, if you think what the printing press did to politics and society in Europe, speed that up for what's about to happen in the decades ahead and accelerate it further when we start to think, and I'm sure we'll come on to this in the conversation, about artificial intelligence and this great challenge that lies ahead of us as to whether we will work for the robots or the robots will work for us. So how do we, as diplomats and people who care about this world, get on the right side of tech? How do we make the tech work for us and ensure that we're not working for the tech? I think very briefly, there are 3 ways that we can really take back control of diplomacy and do that. People say that the great leaders can set a vision, they can communicate it, and they can put the structures in place then to deliver it. I think the great leaders I saw close up can do all 3 of those things. And incidentally, and I'm too much of a diplomat to reveal which one is which, but the prime ministers I worked with could each do 2 of those 3 things very well, but not the third. The vision, the communication, and the delivery. Maybe later I'll give you some more clues as to which was which. So for diplomacy, we've got to get the vision right. And this was my real message in trying to reform the Foreign Office, the review that we did in 2016, and the review we did of the UN in 2017 is, what is our driving sense of purpose? What's the point of what we do? And for me, it all comes back to the first prehistoric person who convinced those around him or her to go hunting together rather than to be clubbing each other over the head, competing for resource. We have these 2 competing instincts, survival of the fittest or that collaboration to work together. And really, diplomacy has always at its best existed in that space. And now we find ourselves in a world where we're surrounded by people who think that the answer to the 21st century is to build a bigger wall. How do we take that on? How do we be the people that battle for coexistence? Because that coexistence, what Islamic State attack as the gray zone, What Donald Trump attacks when he says, I can take you back to a time when you didn't have to live with people who were different to you. That coexistence is where the real creativity and ingenuity happens, where the solutions to the 21st century are found. So we've got to get that sense of purpose back. Then we have to communicate much, much more effectively. And I tried to do this in Lebanon, tried to use the smartphone to connect with people in different ways. When my government told me I couldn't go and give condolences to the Iranian embassy after a terrorist attack. We had no relationship with Iran at the time because they'd burnt our embassy in Tehran. I went down to the Iranian embassy and donated blood outside, and the photo went viral in Tehran. We were able to use the smartphone and the power of social media to connect with Iranians in a way that our predecessors couldn't. When I wanted to challenge people in the Middle East about treatment of domestic workers, rather than give one more speech or write one more article, I became a domestic worker. And more importantly, Kalkidan Nagusi, the Ethiopian domestic worker who was showing me her job, she became the ambassador for 2 days and stood there in front of the cameras and said, you've got to start treating us with dignity, with respect. And it led the news that night. So we can use these new tools more effectively. And I was so worried that for the last decade, we were losing the internet because Putin and others were weaponizing it against us. Trump was weaponizing it against us. And so in the midst of this horror and tragedy in Ukraine, how wonderful is it to see President Zelensky using the internet to fight back, using these tools in that way. And then the third thing we have to do as a craft, as diplomacy, is then to get the delivery right, to stick around and deliver stuff. I think the most extraordinary leader I saw close up in the last 2 decades was Angela Merkel, of all the European leaders, because she stuck around and delivered stuff. While my leaders and other leaders were racing to their press conference to deliver the soundbite, she was quietly making stuff happen. And I think we really need that in European diplomacy, especially right now. We might come on later to the wider thoughts in the new book about how actually education might be upstream diplomacy. And that maybe if we can create a generation that thinks more like diplomats, that uses the emotional intelligence, the empathy, the curiosity about the world that diplomats develop, then maybe education becomes upstream diplomacy. Maybe we create a safer world there. We create a generation that can balance head, hand, and heart in new ways. But for now, I think I'll stop there and hand over to my colleagues, but just with a final thought that when you look at the challenges of the world today, it's clear to me that from the next migration crisis, the next pandemic, the next economic crisis, the rise of artificial intelligence, climate, insecurity across Europe and beyond, when you look at all of those crises, if diplomacy didn't exist, we would have to invent it. But now, as we look at this technological transformation around us, we'll have to reinvent it. We'll have to reinvent diplomacy. Thank you.
Hi, is it working? Thanks very much, Tom. I'm David Clark. I'm your question master for the evening. When you do ask a question, please say who you are and who your question is addressed to. I mean, I'm sorry, but before I'm jumping ahead because we have our 2 discussants who are going to speak, and after that we have the questions. I beg your pardon.
Present and future. Keep the picture and what just brought to other things.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Tom, for this very challenging. I mean, it's difficult to speak after you because I know you are a very good speaker and very inspiring, and I also enjoyed reading your books. I liked in the 10 survival skills for a world in flux. I really liked the emphasis that you put on education, and I like the idea of making young people look more like diplomats, and especially here in Luxembourg, I think we are also very sensitive to that. I mean, this is a multicultural country, so languages are an essential tool, and international education and through various school systems. Erasmus, unfortunately, I think Britain doesn't participate anymore, but that's certainly also very important. And but I, you touch on many subjects, but I think I would come back to the subject that I know best, and that is diplomacy. I mean, I think I share many things that you say about the need to adapt, and I think it's fair to say that diplomacy has really adapted over the years. Um, the profession has changed, like many other professions. And when you look at the diplomats today, I think we see a more diverse group. I think there's more ethnic diversity in our colleagues, more gender equality. I'm glad to see two women ambassadors here tonight, and so I think that's important. And there is also, I think, I know you make fun a little bit of diplomatic life, of cocktails. I think it's fair to say that there's less formality today. That diplomats work, with the business community. They really try to represent the whole of government and also population as a whole, your country actually. And about digital tools, I think it's also fair to say that now so many ambassadors are tweeting and that sometimes I think some are more talented than others, but it's certainly useful. And this is, of course, no longer the time of the Congress of Vienna, where ministers were and diplomats assembled for a whole year to reorganize Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. And also some archives that I found when I was in Washington. I mean, it seems that the Luxembourg ministers, they could leave the country by boat for 2 weeks in order to attend the IMF and World Bank meetings in Washington, followed by the General Assembly of the UN in New York. So those were different times. Today, we know communication is fast, information is immediate and omnipresent. And that has affected our work, which is a lot about reporting. And as you said, there is so much competition with newspapers, news agencies, internet. I mean, everything is available online. So what can diplomats do? I mean, they report about situation in their host country, but I think they need to find the real value added. And I think it really comes from the fact that they are on the ground, they know people, they can network, and but it's a challenge, certainly. And when I started my career, we were still using telexes, and most reports were sent by mail. And I was in Washington, and we would get our local newspapers after 2 weeks when they were completely outdated. Now we know that we are working on the instant and email system allow us to send it to all relevant authorities immediately. Social media, I think, is, as you said, is very important because it's about communication, and we use communication to promote our country's interests, our values, also to better understand the people, what people are thinking. And I was very impressed by what you were telling us about and what you were writing about your experience as ambassador to Lebanon. I think you are certainly a model in that, and I think we have to learn from that, and all diplomats should think about how communication gets you closer to people and allows you also to reach a much wider public. You mentioned WhatsApp groups, and that's a new tool also, I think, for diplomats. It's also useful to communicate, exchange information, working better together. And sometimes Twitter is a very good source of information. I remember on the evening of the 15th July 2016, I was ambassador in Turkey, and suddenly jets started to fly over my building, and we have no idea what is happening. And so my first reaction was to go to Twitter, and through the social media activity, I realized quite quickly that there was an attempted coup underway, and that was long before any news channel was able to communicate about it. So yes, it's a very useful tool, and we saw that the pandemic has also encouraged this because it wasn't possible to meet in person, so video conferences, you all know it, became the rule. But even at the level of head of state and government, and it's not always easy, and it causes other problems because you have to work on secure networks. And maybe you all remember the day when there was a ministerial meeting and suddenly a journalist appeared on the screen among the ministers. So this is a new fact about technology. How do you make it really safe for important meetings that should not be shared with everybody? So there are probably many advantages to using these new technologies, and I'm sure in the discussion later you will give more clues on how to do that, how to use them to solve global crises today. Um, I really believe that technology is very useful for communication and, as I said, spreading values, promoting values, spreading messages to a large number of people. And I think it really helps to better understand global issues. In your book, I think you said it too. I think big data, artificial intelligence will be able to analyze trends, predict the future, and it's probably true that these technologies might be better at it than diplomats are. Let's see, but I think this will be useful to see how it works. But technology, does it really provide solution, or is it a tool to complement the work of diplomats? And what are the limitations of digital diplomacy? Do we have to turn to When do we have to turn to a more traditional diplomacy? And what is traditional diplomacy? I mean, I would say it's the one that is conducted by professionals, often behind the scenes, because we know negotiations are often in secluded rooms. In the broader sense, it involves all the efforts by governments in their interaction with other governments to ensure peaceful coexistence between nations. I think that's the ultimate aim of diplomacy, is to preserve peace, and it involves negotiations, but also knowing how to compromise in the interest of a common solution. And in most cases, I mean, there is sometimes glamour involved in diplomatic life, but mostly it's hard work, I guess, and a lot of patience, because you have to sit there for hours, sometimes negotiating about changing a comma. But also, in most cases, it's true that you are negotiating about important national interests, and so it's important to have that endurance. And we should not underestimate the human factor in international relations, being able to create trust and confidence, and having a network of trusted people. Of course, when all efforts fail and a war takes place, then we still need diplomacy to maintain channels of communication, negotiate the end of the conflict, and prepare for a post-conflict settlement. And this is exactly what we are witnessing right now. And as you saw, many leaders like President Macron, Chancellor Scholz, Prime Minister of Israel, are talking to President Putin, and talking is the only way to send messages and find diplomatic solutions. Um, so they have to be ready in case the Russian president would agree to start negotiations, or they can help to be intermediaries between the parties. And of course, the results we are seeing now of those dialogues, talks, are really um, not very substantial at this stage, but these efforts cannot be assessed in the short term. And as we know today, there are also direct talks between the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia in Turkey. So dialogue is important. It's essential, but you need to be talking and negotiating from a position of strength. And that brings me a little bit to the power side of diplomacy. In order to deter your opponent to start a war or to stop further escalation or extension of the war. So it's very important to have this position of strength, power when possible. So diplomacy has a number of tools, and we are witnessing how they are being used today. As you know, I spent some time at NATO, and we have been strengthening the eastern flank of NATO since 2014, after the annexation of Crimea. And NATO has been providing assistance to Ukraine. And today, I think the main purpose is to prevent the extension of the conflict to NATO territory. The EU is buying and supplying weapons for the very first time to a country at war. And the EU also has shown remarkable unity in adopting powerful sanctions, financial, economic, closing its airspace, targeting oligarchs together with the US, UK, and many others. And despite the high cost to European businesses. And the purpose, of course, is to make the war so costly to Russia that it can be persuaded to end it or to enter into negotiations. So these are the tools. Of course, they are not always as successful as we would like to, but nevertheless, I think they can help, and they will help us to find solutions. So communications, as we said, is very important, and it's actually, and you mentioned that too. I think it's really incredible to see how President Zelensky is present on the media scene. Ukrainians are contacting, I mean, citizens are contacting world leaders to tell them what is happening in Ukraine right now. So there is a real battle of information taking place in parallel to the real war. So dialogue, negotiation, strong sanctions are the other side of the equation, and they will hopefully contribute to a solution. So my conclusion, if I can conclude, I mean, it's just that, of course, digital diplomacy and traditional diplomacy complement each other, and information is important. At least it's important in our liberal democracies. We know that for authoritarian regimes, social media represents a danger, and they are often, social media are the first to be shut down when opposition is expressed. But at the end, there is always comes the moment when governments will have to sit down and negotiate, and they will have to demonstrate the political will, and that's probably the basis of everything, the political will to reach an agreement. And in that respect, things haven't changed that much since the Congress of Vienna.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. Very, very interesting. Diplomats need to communicate, need communication. Communicate, they either need to network or they need tools, electronic, digital tools. Networking in COVID situations is difficult, but you still have the tools unless they're shut off. And tools and how they can be used, and how they will be used, and whether or not they will replace or accompany diplomacy in the future. I think Urban Gilström will be happy to explain to us.
Thank you so much. With such distinguished speakers in diplomacy, I'm not going to try to cover that topic, but I think with 30 years in the tech industry, I think I can talk about technology with some knowledge. And I think whether we live in a digital age, whether we like it or not. And in 2003, I was selling the first few smartphones in the United States. This was just after when Steve Jobs launched the first music service called iTunes, if you remember. And just a few years before he launched the iPhone, that really changed the mobile phone industry for all of us in the industry. It virtually killed the rest of the industry. I'd already been in the tech industry for 10 years, working all over the world. And despite this, I couldn't even dream about where we would be now in 2022, only 20 years after. As Tom said, this is just accelerating. It's going to go even faster in the coming years. It's been a tremendous accelerating development with smartphones, technology, digital platforms such as the GAFAMs, you know, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. And you can also add Netflix and Airbnb and Tesla and Uber and Spotify, many different platforms. And this has given us a lot of benefits and opportunities, but there are also several challenges with this. And as Tom interestingly wrote in his book, this also changed the best traditional diplomacy into I-diplomacy, where the best diplomats had to go naked, like Jamie Oliver and like the Naked Chef, and became naked diplomats, preferably with an iPad to cover their modesty, not maybe the iPhone, because of the size. They had to become pioneers of this new digital terrain and use all the tools as digital interventionists. Social media became one of the most important tools to connect to people, to influence people, and even influence countries, elections, and to change the world. Used for the better good, social media is something tremendously positive, but with both digital and social media is also a darker side. And I've been working in the ad industry as well, so I come from the darker side. The problem is that we all are the product today. We are paying with our integrity, our data, and our lives. Everything we do is tracked digitally. We are being spied on, and this information is being sold to third parties using this information to sell us something or earn money on us. Yes, we all agreed to this, to the use of platforms for free, right? And we even gave our consent to this, right? We agree that the platform will store all our family photos, that they can use our pictures, right? So where is the integrity? Where is the trust? And I think it's also important for the way we use technology going forward. We are spending a lot of our time on social media. In average, we spend 2.5 hours per day. And some people, the young generation, even 6 to 8 hours per day. But are we really doing something important every day for the people in need, for the climate, for the world? Or are we steered by algorithms and echo chambers to read, consume, and act in line with someone else's agenda and commercial interests? This is at a time when the world outside is on fire and we need to act faster. And there is so much fake news and fake facts and fake advertising, spam, deep fake on digital platforms and social media today. And we know that people, especially the young generation, the Z generation, they would like to get their news and facts and knowledge via social media. However, it's very difficult to know that the information is real, that the source is trustworthy, and this is distorting the knowledge for people. And here education is key. I think that is the very topic of your second book. What about if there would be a way to do this differently? What about if there would be a way to put the action and the power in the hands of the people by acting responsibly with respect and trust? What about if there would be a way to avoid deep fakes on digital media to create a safe green heaven for internet users? All the platforms today are mainly American and there are a few Asian platforms out there. Could this be done in Europe, perhaps? I think it's a bit of a challenge that we have too few European platforms at the moment. Finally, I personally find Tom's 10 survival skills, and you came back to this as well, as very useful for the solutions that I just talked about. And just to mention quickly, the top survival skills in the last book that is here today is really number 1, take back control. Number 2, be curious, find the purpose, find your voice, find, grow, and mobilize your community, coexist, be kind, live with technology, be global, and be a good ancestor. And I think this is something that could be very good keyword for the way that I would like to drive things going forward. So with that, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you so much, David.
Good. Questions. So as I was saying, please say who you are and who your question's addressed to. You can, if you wish, address them to all the panel, but please go ahead. Armand.
Despite the fact that my voice is still at the high age of 72 rather strong, but for how long, I don't know, of course. Referring to a few remarks, very, very briefly, that were made about social media, I would like to ask a question. Social media, a blessing or a curse? Is it perhaps a new form of democracy, a deepening and improving of democracy, or is it a form of, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation in English, ochlocracy or ochlocracy, the rule of the mob, ochlocracy, which Aristotle said was the degeneration of democracy. You have the example of now what we are in the midst of Ukraine. If you look at social media, I don't have the courage anymore to do this to myself, but what you see is emotions, passions, insults, confusions, hysteria, but very seldom a word of wisdom. So I think social media, they take in general the political discourse down, and also politicians, and also journalists. Journalism, that, if you look what the traditional newspapers, the serious, so-called serious newspapers are writing these days. It's a shame, as if they had all lost their head, their mind. Somebody talked, I refer to Arlette's, Arlette, after all those years, last time was in Prague, where you praised me, introducing me, and then I attacked the Czech foreign minister, but you had left, fortunately. I would remind of Clausewitz. War is a continuation, without elaborating, is the continuation of politics by other means. I think we should all in this present crisis remember this. I think Arlette said it's important to talk from a position of strength in the present and in general in the present situation. Is that true? You said this. Yes, but I would talk, if I look at Europe, a famous sentence from Hamlet, from Shakespeare, comes to my mind. To paraphrase it, he said about women, of course, one can't say this about women anymore, but perhaps about Europe. Europe, thy name is frailty. I would say, so where can Europe muster some strength? This will it would take a lot of time to develop. I'm finishing. What we are seeing now, that's important. I devoted decades of my life to nuclear strategy. I'm no longer, certainly, if I ever was, contrary to what the Tageblatt wrote today in the introduction of a 2-page interview with me, one of the best experts worldwide on these questions. I said, perhaps I was this, and perhaps even not that. But this war takes place, we should not forget this, in the shadow of nuclear weapons. And that means, or what my former good friend Albert Waldstetter called the delicate balance of terror. So it leads to paralysis at all levels, not just military, but also political. Let's not forget this. And a word, somebody mentioned trust, importance of trust. And I would, in that context, introduce the notion of social capital. So to enlarge it somewhat. These days, not many scholars work anymore on social capital. It was fashionable some years, some time ago, some decades ago. Sorry, I'm always very long. I would have, of course, much more to say, but I'm not the co-lecturer.
Thank you, Arne. Yes, well,
Thank you very much. My name is Vivian Redding, and I would like to come back to a sentence which Tom Fletcher has said. He has, of course, spoken about the speed of the development of technology, and we haven't seen anything yet because AI is only starting. And then he asked the question, does the technology work for us or do we work for technology? And that is exactly the crux of the matter. I still remember the wake-up call with the Cambridge Analytica problem, where we saw for the first time how the misuse of technology could influence directly an election. It was tried out during the Brexit period and then put into real practice during the Trump election. And on it goes. We know about the troll factories in Russia. We have seen the disinformation campaigns everywhere. And we have also seen as a perfect example, and it was said, how on the same token, sincerity and emotions can pass with the president of Ukraine, giving the counter example. But how can this really be utilized? How can it be put in practice? How can we go ahead in order to allow the simple citizen to understand when there is a troll speaking to him or when there is a human being speaking to him? And why do you think that, well, we have to speak of technology and the speed of politics, which are simply not on the same velocity. And it took a decade to come up with a Digital Service Act in order to break down at least a small part of it. And I am afraid it's going to be much too slow. So what is the solution? And how could we utilize AI in a positive way in order to give an answer and to rebuild the trust in a world which, unfortunately, you have said very careful, you have said it very politely, that the distrust is taking over, and it is a fact.
Does anybody want to respond?
I can try to start, but I'd love to hear from the others as well, because those are, I mean, it's a terrific kind of rich set of questions there. I mean, Arno, is social media a blessing or a curse? I think it's both. Has been both so far. It does allow us a connection with a whole society that we weren't able to have before. We've always had to have a conversation just with elites. And I agree completely with Arlette that the real added value of diplomacy ultimately is the last 3 feet. It's that human connection, which can't really be replaced, at least I don't think in any of our lifetimes, by a piece of AI or a smartphone. But in addition to that, we are able to have this connection with a whole society that we weren't before. I think one of the most exciting areas of academic work around diplomacy in the next decade will be the point at which understanding social media connects with an understanding of collective psychology and peacemaking and diplomacy to see if we can reframe the conversations about our shared history. Can we heal the wounds of history? Can we almost have a collective therapeutic conversation about our past and the wounds of our past, which means that future generations don't carry those forward? And I don't think we're there yet. We certainly aren't there yet, as you say, Arno, with the way that the social media debate is happening at the moment. I used to say something very silly going around the Middle East in 2010, 2011, beginning of the Arab Spring, and I'd wave the smartphone, I'd say, this is the most powerful weapon in the Middle East. And of course, Bashar al-Assad had other ideas. You know, his chemical weapons were more powerful. The threat of Iranian nuclear weapons were more powerful. You know, the arms, the guns of Hezbollah and Syrian militia were more powerful. But over time, I do think that there is that real power to bring communities together, and that is terrific. But we have to try and win that space. People in diplomacy often say to me that there are too many risks about using social media, and you identified many of them. You know, it's very real for me as ambassador, because the smartphone that I was trying to communicate with people on was also the device that terrorists were using to track my movements. So it was a very real risk. Every time I tweeted, it made me more vulnerable to attack. And yet I think the biggest risk is actually not to be out there engaging. If we leave that space to the radicalizers and the Trumps and the Islamic States and so on, then we lose in the end. Just to bring that really to your thought, to the Commissioner's thought, that the rules, can the politics keep up? I mean, it's a real challenge to us at the moment. And in all the conversations about updating the rules of the internet, the laws of human rights, we're finding that governments just simply can't keep pace. I tried with the work with the UN to initiate a conversation about lethal autonomous weapons. And so we wrote a letter. 200 tech leaders wrote to the UN Security Council and said, we are creating risks faster than we can manage them. That you have to work on, you have to give us new rules. And as you can imagine, knowing these systems much better than I did, the UN formed a committee which took 2 years deciding who should draft the reply to the letter, by which stage the lethal autonomous weapons had moved on, you know, another 2 years of development. So we have to find ways to keep pace. And maybe when we think about the peace processes of the future, maybe we won't just think about peace processes between Israel and Saudi Arabia and between Europe and Putin's successor, or between North and South Korea, but peace with big tech. How do we translate between governments and the tech companies in a way that doesn't mean that we completely fail to keep up? Just one final thought on this, really about the AI point. I think the key to this is to focus on what makes us human. And I was very struck visiting the schools in California where the kids of the tech emperors are being educated, that the tech really is working for them, but that they are focused on learning creativity, problem solving, teamwork. They're learning to be curious and kind, those sorts of skills that people call 21st century skills, and I'm calling them diplomacy. They're learning all of that rather than just learning to code. And I think the more that we can focus on those skills, the more that we can set the world up to ensure that the AI doesn't become our last invention. But Oban, I'm conscious that you know much, much more about AI than I ever will.
So maybe start with social media. I think there is a fair amount of responsibility that has to be taken by the platform themselves to make sure that that there aren't these kind of bad things. I mean, it was well known, the Cambridge Analytica, the whistleblower situation. It was well known that young people didn't feel so well on social media, especially young girls. It has been well known, but there's not been taken enough action. So I think a fair amount of regulation and control is important. And then I think everyone that also are using social media, because governments can certain cases try to block social media because they don't like it, and diplomats and politicians can try to use and influence also by using social media. I think it's very important that kind of staying on the right side of how far we go, and that's about trust. It's about respecting people. It's about really following the ground rules of human respect. I think that's very important. Then on AI, I think in general, I think still with AI, we're very much relying on the human aspects for AI to work, and that's going to be like that for a long time. And I think that after a couple of years working with Accenture on this topic, they are very big on AI and applied intelligence. And I think what I see there is that to build in the human aspects of emotional intelligence and emotional aspects of human aspects is very important, because AI is very much on the IQ side, but it's very difficult to kind of replicate the emotional quality with AI. So that's still very important, human aspects, and that's going to be necessary for a long time. So.
Let's go. Do you want to say?
No, I basically agree that the human factor is going to be the important fact, and especially for I mean, if we take the case of autonomous lethal weapons, how can we make sure that there will be in the future a human decision behind those weapons? So certainly that is the big challenge. And, AI has a big potential. It can do many things, but we'll have to draw the limits what it can do. But maybe I'll just come back to the question of speaking in a position of strength. I think we are. It's true that probably Europe, especially, has not until now shown all the potential, all the strength that it can have. But I think we are seeing a moment here in our European history where sanctions that we have taken, the fact that Europe will be buying and delivering weapons to Ukraine. I think there is a realization that Europe can do more, and certainly we will see in the future. I think that many will step up defense expenditures, and that confronted to the situation in Russia. I mean, Europe has always progressed. We know it through a crisis. So this is such a moment, I think.
Thank you. Before we go on, I just want to say a big thank you to Mrs. Redding for allowing us all to talk to each other in Europe at a very reasonable cost. Many thanks indeed for that. Meta, you had a question, I think, about education. Do you want to? Can we have a?
That's on.
Is it? Yeah. No, you write really convincingly about the different. Is it working? Not?
Yes.
Yeah, about the different ways of learning and how we need to actually accommodate and change, because some people are left-brained, some are right-brained, and if we don't learn in the same way, and you give lots of examples how it can be improved. And I cannot help but say, to ask quite practically, how do we do this? Because we've lived in England and France, and I'm Danish. So I've known 3 different systems of teaching. And when we took our long-suffering children, one of whom is sitting over there, to France, which we love, it was suddenly a system where teachers spoke, you wrote down. Teachers say the same up in Normandy as he does in Nice, in history or whatever. And there's so little room for maneuvering. So how do we change that?
So thank you for bringing this up. I will try and keep it short because I'm sure we can have a conversation about this for weeks because it's a real passion for me. I do think we're at this sliding doors moment where if we don't change the education system, then we really will find we're in decades and decades of this instability and polarization. 3 quick practical thoughts then. So one is we've been doing some work with UNICEF to develop a global learning passport, which actually means that the qualifications that you get are much more portable. As you mentioned, especially anyone who's worked in many different countries, you feel that friction between the systems, the friction between the UK and the French system, for example. So that's at one end of the spectrum, but imagine what it's like then for a Syrian refugee going through 5 systems in 2 years and not being able to take those qualifications along the road with them. So hopefully the global learning passport will help with that. Second practical thought is that I really recommend some of the work that we've been supporting, that the OECD is doing now. Andreas Schleicher, who was the godfather really of the PISA tests. And I think many people would say that in some ways those have taken us in the wrong direction because we're comparing ourselves the whole time. Competition between countries to test and fight over who has the best test results. But I think the great work that Andreas is leading now is developing a curriculum that teaches and assesses global competence. And global competence is, for example, your ability to see the other person's perspective, to see your own filter. What's the Instagram filter through which you see the world? Diplomats, again, we don't really learn that, do we? But we just learn it by, I suppose we develop it by osmosis because we're always analyzing other people, trying to understand their perspective. In a way, that's a very human skill that we're now finding can be tested. And in a way, the challenge is that until it can be tested and assessed, and you can have a bit of paper showing you understood it, then schools and parents and businesses won't take it as seriously as can you memorize some mathematics. So I hope that will be a real breakthrough. Final practical thought briefly is we did lots of work on which constituencies will make the change happen. And our conclusion is that some governments might. You look at the work that Finland has done, for example, on educational reform, but most governments are too invested in the 19th century factory model of education, of just creating people who learn the things that we learned and our grandparents learned. So not governments. I don't think, much as I love the UN and international institutions, I don't think they can do it because they don't have the resource and the support to do it. Much as I love universities, and I now run one, I don't think universities will drive that change because we're very invested in the exam, the current exam model, to tell us who the smartest kids on the planet are. Businesses won't necessarily do it because business regards education as a lab to experiment in or a market, and often as an ego trip. So I don't think any of those constituencies. What about parents? Maybe we'll help to drive it. I say that as someone who really cares, especially after lockdown education, thinks much more about what my kids should learn. But probably if you've been to a parents' evening where the head teacher says, let's do more creativity at the expense of doing maths, good luck to that head teacher. You see the parents get pretty angry pretty quickly about this stuff. If a teacher says, honestly, we should all start learning empathy and do less STEM, you know, they won't be in the job for that much longer. So probably parents will end up being an obstacle. This change will really come by joining up the reformers, but also by empowering young people, because young people, I think, and I wonder if your kids feel the same way, but young people really understand the change that's needed. And it's, you know, this curriculum was based on what young people told me they didn't know, that they weren't being taught, but they recognized they needed to thrive. So that my hope would come from those young people.
Peter, yes.
Thank you, David. It's really a question to the whole panel, but inspired by Tom's remark about education as upstream source of diplomacy, and following on for the question just now. You said who cannot deliver the change, maybe the parents. Are there any examples of either secondary or tertiary institutions where you've seen success? Wondering if you have any views on the United World College model, which was designed to promote international understanding and is actually growing quite well. And you know, how do you tackle the specific dilemma that you face that in your university, people tend to choose just one subject? Is there a need to have a more perhaps American liberal arts type model where we can then dip into the necessary skills that we're missing? So that's really all I had to say, just to see where is the delivery going, where can we see good models emerging? Thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, I've seen one good example here actually in Luxembourg, where there is a startup in the same place where we are, and they are actually building a youth community for both young students and also university students, where you actually can exchange information, learn more from each other. You can kind of create kind of study groups and work together with other students in the same area, where you actually can discuss the things that you perhaps don't learn directly in the school. It could be many different aspects of learning things that you need to learn for life as well. So I think that's a good example I've seen here in Luxembourg, actually, where a small startup is trying to tackle that problem, working together with the Ministry of Education here in Luxembourg. So I think that's a good initiative I've seen.
I'm also a huge fan of United World College. I think that they've cracked this one. The diversity of the people that they're learning with, but also the content. I'm actually of all the education systems we look most closely at for the research for the book, International Baccalaureate goes a long way in the right direction. And it's interesting, some of the models are coming from perhaps less traditional recent education powerhouses. So they're not, for example, coming to a great extent from the UK, which has decided that rather than teaching how we live together, we'd much rather learn about the wars that we happen to win in history. But you know, for example, Singapore is reforming their education system very dramatically at the moment to put more emphasis on these sorts of skills. You know, I taught a class at New York University that was based in Abu Dhabi, where the 12 students were between them from 20 nationalities, because most of them were dual national. And you just had this enormous breadth of experience. You know, they didn't have to be taught global skills as a class. You know, they just had them because of that interaction they were having. On Oxford, one experiment I'm running starting from next Monday is I'm teaching a 2-week course called Head, Hand, and Hertford, which is trying to teach life, work, and citizenship to our kids, our students, sorry. So that we don't just have brilliant anthropologists and computer scientists and philosophers, but that they are also able to learn from each other's disciplines. And a final thought is that the more that we can make higher education and actually secondary education as well, all education and lifelong education open to groups that are currently disadvantaged, the faster this change will happen. It's much easier to learn these skills from that more diverse, inclusive group than it is to just be taught them in a top-down hierarchical way. I've been saying the hierarchies aren't working, trust isn't there. So the more we can mix those groups up in that way, the better. I've taught classes of refugees who've crossed the Mediterranean. They don't need to learn resilience. They can teach resilience.
The lady back there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Sophia Landry. I have two questions. One, I would like to go back to the diplomacy question. And it seems to me that there is a kind of competitions between diplomats to be seen and to dominate the social networks. Is that detrimental? And how does that competition work? And how do you, as a diplomat, make sure that it's the right people you get in front of the person you want to communicate with? So that's one. And my other question is coming back maybe to the education and question we were just discussing. There is a book that's you probably know called Factfulness. And to me, how do we, in a world where we have so many means of knowledge, do not know about the basic facts? And how can we make sure that the population has access to these basic facts and is not lost in deep fakes and other things? Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. So 2 questions. One about competition between diplomats to get your voice across, and secondly, factfulness. And of course, getting facts right is one of the hardest things in this age. Who'd like to tackle that one?
Shall I try the diplomacy one, and then you want to try the facts? We'll see. See which ones. On the diplomacy one, so when I started tweeting in, I suppose, 2011, when I got to Lebanon, it was just fantastic. It was anarchy. And we were building the plane as we flew it. And the wonderful thing was that in London, they just said, just get on with it. Until ministers noticed. And then ministers got quite grumpy that we were all accumulating these followers. And so we had a message out that said, you can do whatever you want as long as it's not in the UK media, which was a kind of fundamental misunderstanding of how Twitter works. But it was a brilliant era. And at that time, there were 4 British ambassadors on Twitter. And now I think there are probably only 4 who aren't on Twitter. So there's a different kind of challenge now. And I think really you touched on it, that there is a tendency, I think, for lots of diplomats to tweet at each other and at their own capital. And so some of it is just to demonstrate to your bosses or colleagues at home that you're doing lots of brilliant things. And I always say to diplomats when we're doing training on how to do social media that actually you almost imagine it like I let you touched on the classic receptions and so on. If it was a classic reception, imagine Twitter is like that. You wouldn't be silent as a diplomat. You'd be in the mix, in the conversations. You'd be moving around. You'd be engaging strangers. You'd be joining conversations. You wouldn't just transmit from one end of the room and just shout across the room. You'd actually be listening and interacting. So I think you can bring those very human diplomatic skills to social media as well, and then actually you can use it successfully as a tool and actually hold more of the space and win more of the arguments. I think it has to be 3 things: authentic, engaging, and purposeful. The authenticity is people want to feel they understand, they know the person behind the handle. It's why people follow Donald J. Trump and not President of the United States, for better or for worse. Engaging, it's got to be content that can compete with everyone else's content. And purposeful, because we're not there to be comedians, or we're not there just to get lots of likes and retweets. Is it contributing to the promotion of my country's values, prosperity, and security? And I hope that with many diplomats, you can put all their tweets together and you can see it adds up to something. And it's not just trying to get attention. I haven't tried facts and critical thinking? I'm handing over. That's the harder question.
I'm afraid that's too hard, unless someone in the audience feels that they can have a crack at that. No, I should just add, I was brought up by a statistician whose whole mission in life was facts, and he used to accumulate them at an extraordinary pace. You probably don't want to hear me on the subject. It is, I think, it's a pretty important question.
Just one line on facts then, which is I think that this era is very similar to the period after the creation of the printing press, when actually you had decades of everyone just shouting at each other and printing slander. You know, there's lots of libel and a great cacophony of noise. And it took time for not just the rules to catch up, and we've touched on the rules and regulations, but also the norms of society to catch up. And I think one very interesting thing we're seeing actually with the Ukraine conflict is there's much more awareness now of trolling, of fake news, of what did the White House spokesman call it? Alternative facts. I think we are becoming collectively more discerning, and you know I've seen that just in the move from the Syria conflict to the Ukraine conflict. So we're getting there.
Yeah, and I think from a technology point of view, I think there are so many tools out there we can use for fact control. So if Google can scrape the whole internet and index the whole internet, then there are more and more research programs on how to actually see if there is deep fake in the information by using artificial intelligence for finding fake news and fake facts and checking the sources. So I think using tech for controlling tech in a way, because I think it's going to be very important.
Thank you. Nevzat Arslan. I am from Turkish Embassy. I am the first counselor. I think the most important task of diplomats is to ensure peace. As Madame Konzemus very rightly precised, is to ensure the coexistence of states, because there are the states which compose the international system. So when we look at now what is happening in Ukraine, it is really unbelievable. 2 months back from now, maybe nobody would think that this will happen. So there is a failure for the whole world, I think, including diplomats and diplomacy. And according to you, what didn't work in Ukraine? Why we had this? Because especially for Europe, just after the World War, we can talk about a great success. But now we are talking about nuclear war. So what is your point of view on it? Thank you.
So very briefly, because I know there are lots of questions, and it's a huge subject, and deserves much more time. I mean, one irony of the last few weeks, I was actually launching the book with a talk on soft power and how do we make our countries more magnetic. Big theme in foreign policy work at the moment. And of course, behind me on the screen, Putin's tanks were ready to roll across the border in a 19th century display, 20th century display of real hard power. And of course, our retaliation was initially all about hard power as well. It was about economic sanctions, you know, really classic tools of diplomatic statecraft. I mean, very briefly in this case, I think part of the problem has been that we have consistently underestimated Putin over the years, despite the signals he's given us in so many different ways of the way that he will operate. And I say that having really lived through that Syria crisis very, very close up in Lebanon and seen many of these tactics used before. I think part of it is a failure of the global international system that I touched on early on. A system that has actually been vandalized by leaders like Trump, orphaned by a leader like Trump at various moments, but also has also been systematically vandalized by Putin as well. But one thing I would push back against is this sense that some in the media, and you get quite a bit on Twitter, that Putin is this great strategic genius and he's outthought all of us. The difference between us and Putin is he's willing to kill at scale to get what he wants, and the rest of us aren't. It's not that he's smarter than NATO, smarter than the rest of us. It's just that he is completely unscrupulous.
Perhaps I could just interject. I'm studying international. Oh, sorry, I'll let you on. Please.
No, but I largely agree that we have misread, I think, what happened in Russia. Although, I mean, as you said, there were some clear signals, and it started in 2008, Georgia. I mean, there were speeches, and the problem is that President Putin, he does what he says. So, I mean, if we were reading his speeches more carefully, we would have known what he was up to, and the same about the weapons he's developing. Everything is on paper, and we can read it. And he made a big speech last summer where I think, again, we didn't want to understand what he was telling us. So that's yes, it's a failure, and everything was there. But I think the point is, I mean, when it comes back to the fact that we are liberal democracies, we see progress in a different way. We didn't want to see it coming. I think it's a denial, and so that we will have to see how to react to that in the future.
If I could just interject, as a student of international relations myself, a lot of the emphasis of the academics is in non-state relations, and you see how Black Lives Matter has spread throughout the world, how LGBT, Q, sorry, I lose my lesson. These are movements which are non-state movements, which are incredibly influential. But Putin has reminded us that actually plain old-fashioned military intervention is still there, but I hope it's on the way out, but we have to live with it for the time being.
Hello, my name is Florence Kenner. I'm in the Luxembourg Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm very humbled today to be in the presence of our first women ambassador. It's very nice to meet you, and I'm stepping into some very big steps here. We are in the presence of other very inspiring women here today, and I'm going to touch on two things. You mentioned inequality and you mentioned truth. So first, inequality. We're talking about tech developments. What about the 40% that actually don't have access to the internet right now? Where's their future in a digital diplomacy? Secondly, 80 to 90% of coders today are men. So where does that leave women? And in a future where we are going to have to use and to abide by algorithms created by men? So that would be the first two questions related to inequality. And then to touch upon truth, I think it was already mentioned briefly before, but how to make the difference between opinions and disinformation. We have struggled with everyone has their own truth, every single person in this room. And so where is the limit between truth and censorship? We see it now with Putin kind of switching off social media all over Russia because dissent is forming, and there's more and more protests inside the country. So where is the future here for diplomacy when you can simply switch off the internet? And what does that mean in the context of today's discussion? Thank you.
I'll try and briefly do those ones. Just on women and diplomacy, by the way, I think I'm much more optimistic about the state of diplomacy today than I was when I wrote that book, because women are showing such leadership in the space. And we've gone in the UK system. When I did the review of the British Foreign Office in 2016, I think only 2 of our top 10 ambassadors were women, and now it's 18 out of 20 in our top missions. We did a really good program where every mission that hadn't been, we had photos up of all the missions that had been led by women, and for every mission that had not yet been led by a woman, the permanent secretary put up a mirror, so people could imagine themselves in that role. And gradually the mirrors are turning, and we only have 2 left, and both will go, I'm confident, fairly soon. On the 40%, I think the easy answer is to say we must just get the internet to them. I think the reality is that the internet alone is not the answer. Whatever happens, big tech will get the internet to them, because it's in big tech's interest to get everyone online. We have to ensure that it's being accompanied by the right kind of education and support to those communities, so that they're not exploited. And to come back to the point I made earlier on, that they're not just treated as a lab, or as a market, or as an ego trip. Much of the intervention by big tech in the global education space falls into those 3 traps. An experiment to test the latest $10 laptop to see if it's then sellable in Luxembourg. That's the kind of spirit that people go into it with. And so we've got to be really careful. It comes back to your point about getting the rules and the regulations, and making sure the politics can keep up with the tech change. And then on tech and truth, I think this is really the point about the peace process between government and tech. At the moment, there's no translation between the two. So when government talks to tech companies, we talk to them as though they're a naughty child messing around in the corner, and they don't really understand how the institutions work. We tell them, understand rules and institutions, and they just think, they look at us like a very boring grandfather or uncle, and they just think we're going to move fast and break things. Whereas we say, can we just move very slowly and to build things? And maybe we need to work together to actually move fast and build things together, to change that conversation, to say to them, how do we solve problems together? Roban touched on it in the sense of defending facts and truth online. There's a real need for big tech to solve that problem with us. So we need to make sure we're getting the peace process right, to get the right people in the room to solve those problems together. The challenge is, unlike we touched on the Congress of Vienna, in the Congress of Vienna, we knew who could go in the room. It was basically the winners went in the room. The only debate was, should we let France in? Always a good debate to have. Now, who goes in the room to debate big tech? Who gets a place at the table? Who convenes the room? Who goes in the room to debate climate change? Who convenes that conversation? That's a real challenge for diplomacy.
To be fair, on the Congress of Vienna, it's one of the only peace treaties where the loser actually got a place at the table, even if he was a representative of the aristocracy.
Yeah, I was going to comment on how to bring technology to more people in the world. I think by continuing building infrastructure, I think in the 90s we were building the mobile infrastructure, and then the internet went mobile after that. So I think that put a lot more internet in the hands of more people, but still there are still a number of people that can't afford to have a mobile phone. And I think there are other community initiatives that has to happen out in the field by bringing together communities where maybe people can have one phone per village and kind of share this connectivity, and some more community work by both tech and startups, I think, is important. Then the problem with women in coding is a huge problem. I mean, we're recruiting coders, and it's just the fact that 80% of the response we get is from male coders. Luckily, we have 2 out of the 3 coders we have working with well in our countries are actually women, but now we're looking for more. And I know it's a huge challenge. I think it's about education, it's about doing this kind of hackathons and have female role models getting out there and really kind of out in the schools and telling that it's actually very cool to do coding and build those new algorithms. I agree, it's very important that we have the right diversity also in everyone building those algorithms, because the market out there is actually a lot more women that will use those services. So I think it's a very, very difficult topic, but we need to work on that. And truth and censorship it's a really hard one. So I think you addressed it quite well. And because on one hand, governments may shut down the access to social media, and okay, that's absolutely not the right way. And how do we secure truth, and how do we actually, how can the tech companies take responsibility? That is very, very difficult. I mean, we've seen that there's been a lot of untrue things on social media that has not been taken care of, and it has to be taking more responsibility for the truth and trust among the companies and all the parties. I think is very important.
Does it work? Okay. Hi, I'm Margot Boucher. I'm from Belgium. I might be one of the youngest people in the room. I'm 22, from 1999 still, so it's okay, I would say. And I could be considered, I'd say, the voice of Generation Z or the Zoomers who, are going to come after the millennials who still get so much critique about not being engaged with what is going on in the world today. But I would argue that it's hard to make people interested in things. We're all talking about education, and it's the same thing for women in coding. There's a lot of people that say like, yeah, but maybe women just don't care about coding. I know it's a bit hard for how I get to my actual question, because I actually wrote it down because I was so nervous about asking it. But recently, with following social media, because that's how most of the youth get their media, not just, I'm hearing Facebook, I'm hearing Twitter, but TikTok as well. I've yet to make one, I'm not going to. But when my uncle came to me telling me that I shouldn't get vaccinated because he read something on TikTok that it wasn't a good idea, it links to my question, which is, what's the balance between restricting TikTok? You said previously that it should be on the platform itself that needs to take care of such things, that needs to make sure that the kids don't see swear words, because God knows they don't know what shit means. But what's the balance between the platforms needing to create their content, the governments needing to create the fake news, and maybe just citizens being able to critical for themselves? Can we still ask citizens to be critical for themselves? This is something you're supposed to learn at school, but I consider myself still a normal citizen, but I have a master's education. Actually, a lot of people don't have a master's education. How can you make those people interested in being critical for themselves, in following this education, so that they become critical for themselves? What's the balance between these three factors? Thank you.
Really, really good question. I think just on the generational point, I think you've really hit on something important here, which is that people, I don't know what generation I am actually. Please don't tell me, because I'll be depressed. But whatever my generation is, I think we tend to assume that the problem with tech is young kids are on their phone the whole time. They're distracted. We're fine. Me being on Twitter is okay, but my kids being on TikTok, it's terrible. Their brains, their attention spans are getting shorter. And if only they could be like us and read books. I'm struggling to read that many books at the moment. I'm very distracted, particularly the last 2 weeks. And so in a way, the sorts of skills I'm talking about in order to coexist with tech, particularly around empathy and emotional intelligence, I think it's just as important that these generations learn those skills as that we insist that young people do. If there's one thing we learned from COVID, it's that we have a generation of leaders that struggles to communicate with empathy and emotional intelligence. That was very, very clear. So I think it's really important this doesn't become sort of generational, another battle in the generational war. I think on your question on balance, I think you actually answered the question better than I can, which is to say we do need this balance between, and Orban touched on it as well. There's some of this has got to be government, some of it's got to be the tech companies, and they've got to talk to each other and find that balance. But most of it actually is going to come from us as individuals. You know, in this book, I talked about citizen diplomats. How do we create a generation of citizen diplomats who have those sorts of critical thinking skills? And for them, much of it comes from education. And so we need to reform our education systems. But otherwise, it just comes from this development of the norms in society and that understanding of our role as good global citizens. So I think you've got it exactly right.
I don't think we have all the answers. And if you come to me afterwards, I really would like to listen to your input on this topic, because we're trying to build a responsible social media network, and we really want to listen to the Generation Z exactly on the topic that they bring up. And also the rest of the female group here, it's very important for us. So if you come to me afterwards, I would love to have more input on that topic, because we don't have all the answers.
I had one question which was sent to me from Gaston Moonen, editor of the European Court of Auditors Journal. And his question really was, with all the interdependence which Tom has talked about in his books, how come that diplomacies failed to use that, bring that together to prevent a war in Ukraine? And he then goes on to say, you know, and in addition, how come we have such lagging action on climate change? We haven't really talked about climate change this evening. So perhaps I could put those questions to the panel.
Shall I go first, Alette? Or I mean, I think in Putin's case, and we touched on it a little bit with your question, sir. It's the fact that you have a maverick operating outside those diplomatic conventions, willing to disrupt in that way, willing over time to degrade the institutions that are supposed to restrain that sort of behaviour. It means that there are limits to. I don't think I have every respect for Macron in trying, you know, and going out there and sitting at that ridiculously long table with Putin and trying to reason with him now over humanitarian corridors. But there are moments when diplomacy just doesn't do it, and that you have to resort to harder forms of power. What I would say, though, is that this ends with diplomacy eventually, and I, you know, whether it's with the people around Putin or with his successor, but at some point we have to renew the diplomatic conversation with Russia about their rightful place at the table in the 21st century, their rightful place in working out how we deal with the challenges of the future, including climate change and tech and all the rest of it. So diplomacy comes back eventually, but there are some moments and some individuals which put us beyond what even the greatest diplomats can deal with.
I would just add that, unfortunately, I mean, we should concentrate on climate change. This is probably the first number one global issue that we should be dealing with. And we are now having to take care of a war that is having all sorts of consequences, even on energy, and maybe we will have even more problems on with climate change if we have to. Some countries have to resort to coal production. So yes, it's a failure, but I mean, your conclusion is, I think I agree totally. We will have to go. I mean, unfortunately, a lot will have been destroyed, and will have be much better to start with negotiations from the beginning, because we know what President Putin is asking. As I said earlier, we need to compromise. There will be compromises, but this time I think. Yeah, we'll have to wait until we come to more reasonable situations again.
We're getting, I think, to our time. I'm not sure we really have time for more questions, I'm afraid. Ah, Gaston, hi. Sorry, excuse me if I didn't phrase it correctly.
Clear to many people that the West could also do the unimaginable, which was all the sanctions, the unanimity on the technical issue, because I saw the title, of course, the diplomacy and power and the technological challenge there. And perhaps if the West would have been more clear what the possible consequences would be on the technological front, then, and that's where I thought perhaps that is a learning lesson to take, that you have to be clear if these steps, and for many people, including, I think, many people in Russia, it was not clear what the consequences were so, or could be. And it's also was not clear for many people in the West either, I think. So it's just, the question is really also on, would diplomacy have perhaps had a role there to make this clearer, what possible consequences would be if? Thank you.
Perhaps. I think you might be right. I think perhaps we underestimated how strongly we would actually be able to react. We underestimated our coherence because we've had this period of Trumpian disparity across the international system and incoherence. And I can't blame it all on Trump. It's a longer-term trend around our inability, as those who believe in the international rule of law, to really back it up. And I say that as coming from a country that has threatened to break international law in recent years. So maybe we could have said that more loudly. I suspect Putin wouldn't have believed it. One consequence of what's happening in Ukraine and the response to what's happening in Ukraine is he now does believe that we will react in this way. And so it's no consolation to any of us, and certainly no consolation to the incredibly brave people in Ukraine, but perhaps they've helped to demonstrate that we do still have that coherence and that willingness to strike back, and that our public opinion is behind it in a way that it wasn't when I was in that same game of poker with Putin over Syria, and he was calling our bluff over chemical weapons. He knew, because of the transparent, open conversation we were having with our own public, that we weren't going to back up our own red lines. I think he'd probably feel less sure of that now in Europe.
And above all, I would like to thank the audience for the interesting questions. That was very, very lively, very interesting discussion, revealing. I wouldn't dare to summarize. too many subjects, too many issues. But when you raised your phone and you said this is powerful, it occurred to me that it was the first time in the world's history, human history, worldwide, the tool available to communicate, to avoid war or health diplomacy. And it would be sorry to see that this is a curse, a danger, rather than an opportunity. Hold on this. And thank you again to everybody. And I think the drinks are ready to be served. I'd like to invite everybody to meet again outside. Thank you very much. Thank you.